It started like a fairy tale. Two strangers, instant chemistry, an intimate wedding surrounded by hope. But buried beneath years of separation and broken family ties was a connection even deeper than marriage vows. As they pieced together fragments of the past, old photos, half-remembered places, they realized their lives were bound since birth. The question was no longer how they fell in love, but how they would survive the truth. At first glance, their life together seemed flawless. Mornings held a quiet rhythm, coffee in matching mugs, chairs pulled close, conversation flowing effortlessly. They moved in step without planning, like dancers who already knew the moves. To visiting friends, their home was a portrait of harmony. Photos lined the shelves, laughter lingered long after conversation ended. Their world resembled a romantic movie. Soft music played during meals, a lamp glowed warmly each evening, and daily routines, walks, repeated jokes, reaching for each other's hands, felt essential rather than mundane. Comfort, routine, and stability shaped their days. Yet beneath the ease were subtle, unsettling details. They mirrored each other's gestures and expressions, recalled overlapping childhood memories, and shared phrases that echoed family sayings. At first amusing, these coincidences gradually became a quiet undercurrent in their lives. Even in the home, symmetry was everywhere. Photos angled the same, mugs side by side, frame styles matched without discussion. Their movements through the house synchronized almost instinctively. Friends marveled at how naturally they meshed. But for the couple, the closeness felt deeper than romance, like belonging to one another in ways they couldn't explain. Psychologists suggest attraction often arises from familiarity, echoes of past safety that make bonding effortless. For them, these repeated gestures, shared rhythms, and mirrored expressions drew them closer, reinforcing the sense that they were meant to be. Still, at night, questions surfaced. Why did memories overlap so perfectly? Why did familiar sights feel shared rather than individual? Happiness wrapped them tight, yet a subtle unease lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Outwardly, their marriage appeared perfect. Inwardly, curiosity stirred, sparked by coincidences too precise to ignore. One ordinary evening, a light-hearted conversation over tea would tug at that thread of the past, revealing something that could no longer be laughed away. The evening was quiet, the television off, conversation filling the space. They sat side by side, a half-empty teapot between them. At first, talk was light, plans for the weekend, a neighbour's antics, but it soon shifted. One memory led to another, storytelling that slowed time, and something unexpected stirred. She recalled a childhood park with creaking swings and a spinning roundabout. He interrupted. Surprised, he remembered almost the same park, green benches, cracked path. At first, it seemed coincidence, but as they described details, the match was near exact. Pigeons, fountains, scents. They recalled the same sights, sounds, even smells. Amusement turned quietly unsettled. Phrases from family echoed between them, peculiar expressions that belonged to both. Their memories aligned further. School corridors, light filtering through windows, the squeak of chalk. Familiarity sharpened, no longer comforting but uncanny. Each story tugged another from memory. Street corners, puddles, roasted corn, they recounted them in near-perfect overlap, unsure if the memories were theirs or borrowed. Laughter came, nervous and cracking as they joked about towns that resembled each other too well, but beneath it lay growing unease. By night's end, the teapot cold and lights dim, their laughter faded into silence. The echoes of their childhood no longer felt random. Both sensed that the only way forward was not through stories, but through proof. Photographs and evidence that could speak when memories alone would not. The discovery began quietly. They were on the floor of a cluttered spare room, boxes unopened for years. She pulled a battered folder from the corner and a thin, glossy photograph slid free. At first it seemed ordinary, but the longer she looked, the more it spoke. The photo showed a group outdoors, but her attention caught on a woman in the background, her mother's profile, unmistakable. She felt her pulse stutter. Showing it to him, he saw only a faded snapshot, yet she noticed details that pressed on memory. Fencing, trees, clothing, tiny echoes of afternoons long past. He suggested coincidence. She felt something stronger, almost intentional. Photographs freeze moments, and this one refused to fade into ambiguity. They debated quietly, one clinging to reason, the other drifting toward possibility, the tension thickening with each glance. They studied the clothing, patterns, and small details, signals aligning with blurred memories. On the back, faint handwriting revealed names, one familiar from her family, another from his. Even the style echoed a parent's penmanship. Chance seemed impossible. His dismissal softened as he admitted he had no explanation. The woman's plain expression carried an undeniable charge, hinting at a forgotten crossing of paths, or something deeper. The photograph became a tangible proof of hidden connection, altering the room's atmosphere and their perception of the past. Sleepless, both carried the same thought. If a single image could unlock so much, what else might archives and records reveal? Memory and speculation would give way to evidence, and their search for certainty had only just begun. Their search for answers shifted from stories and photographs into the world of official paper. Curiosity had turned restless, and they both knew that memories alone weren't strong enough to give clarity. They needed something fixed, written down by institutions that were meant to record the truth. What began with a request for a birth certificate soon widened. Adoption papers, relocation records, registration files, all became part of the trail they quietly agreed to follow. The experience felt disorienting from the start. The paperwork arrived slowly, some after weeks, some after repeated calls and letters. Each document arrived with the plainness peculiar to government records: black print, uniform margins, stamps pressed into paper. Yet beneath that cold design, the words carried weight that pressed harder than they expected. They weren't stories told over tea. They were details with signatures filed in offices meant to stand as fact. At first, the files gave them only fragments. Dates of birth listed clearly. Parents' names printed near the top. Residences fixed to locations. But almost immediately gaps began to show. A date altered in handwriting that belonged to no one they knew. A surname almost, but not quite matching the one they remembered growing up with. Places of residence that switched from town to town in short spans of time, with no clear explanation why. These weren't minor clerical slips. They were patterns of movement and disguise that didn't sit naturally. She noticed first that entire lines had been blacked out in one file, portions blurred into illegibility. What should have been a straightforward account of her early years ended with brackets and omissions. He held a record of his own and realized entire months had no trace, as if he had skipped from one place to another without explanation. Their histories, promised on paper, were now raising sharper questions than the ones they carried in memory. They sat together, poring over the files on their dining table. The documents lay in neat piles, sorted by year, but the sense of order they hoped for did not arrive. Numbers didn't line up. Addresses repeated in both their records. though they swore they had never known each other in those places. Time itself seemed unreliable when confronted with stamps and altered notes. Each discovery drew them deeper into silence. Legal archives often present themselves as impartial, sterile repositories, but history offers examples of how they conceal as much as they reveal. Paper can be altered, sealed under orders, or rearranged by officials carrying out policies that separate families. In many cases, children adopted away from their birth relatives find the state itself has built walls around the truth. For this couple, their trail showed traces of those same walls. A hand had passed over the papers at some point, reshaping them, hiding details and forcing them now to read between the lines. The tension inside their home swelled as the papers began to hint at overlaps impossible to ignore. They found household addresses that matched in their forms, though years apart. They found the same surname appearing faintly in each of their files, a connection left unexplained but plainly visible. These were no longer the coincidences of memory. These were institutional materials that had carried the same details across two lives. Conflict rose from interpretation. He gripped at denial, pointing to the inconsistencies as if they proved unreliability. A misprint, a record keeper's mistake, a bureaucratic error. He nodded firmly each time these possibilities appeared, but she felt the terror sharpen. She touched the lines of ink where the same name surfaced, barely breathing as the realization grew inside her. They weren't vague coincidences anymore. They were inscriptions, and inscriptions carried authority. He argued that the secrecy around their childhood homes could explain it. Families relocate, names repeat, governments mishandle documents. His voice grew sharper than usual, defensive, as though the thought itself was dangerous. But she heard the edge of fear behind his denials. They both felt the weight pressing down. If the documents linked them, then everything they had made together stood on ground that might collapse at any moment. The coldness of the paperwork contrasted painfully with the intimacy of what it revealed. A line of print connected their lives more deeply than all the warmth of their home. It was like seeing a medical chart that listed an injury without describing the pain. Detached in form yet devastating in meaning. Sheets of paper read aloud by a clerk would sound practical, but read at their own table carried the pressure of a secret neither of them had asked for. They traced the entries again and again, convincing themselves they might be misreading. But each time they returned, the same overlaps stared back. It no longer mattered whether the documents felt half complete or whether sections were missing. Enough remained to change the way they looked at each other. The paper carried an impartial confirmation. There was family written into their connection. Neither could dismiss it anymore. Their laughter from earlier coincidences had no place here. This was not a fading photograph or a familiar saying heard in childhood. It was ink, dates, names, proof lasting longer than memory. They both sat in silence, the papers spread around them, until the sound of their own breathing was the only thing interrupting the stillness. Their home no longer felt like a safe container of their life together. It felt instead like an archive, each drawer capable of hiding more evidence waiting to surface. If paperwork could expose this much, they knew living voices might hold the rest. Old relatives, figures who had avoided speaking of the past, likely carried the chapters missing from these altered files. The cold trail of documents had brought clarity, but only partial. What remained was to look into the eyes of those who had been present back then, to pull from them the words that ink and stamps had failed to reveal. And in that search, denial would become impossible, because silence itself would begin to sound like admission. They knew the next step was unavoidable. confronting the elders who had lived through the separation and chosen what to hide. They could not ignore it anymore. Paper trails and altered records had spoken louder than memories, so the next step was to carry those questions to the people who had lived back then. The couple arranged visits to older relatives, people they had not spoken to for months, some for years. What they wanted was clarity, but what they walked into was a series of half-confessions that told only part of the story. The first conversation took place in a tidy living room that smelled faintly of mothballs and furniture polish. They sat across from an elder who shifted uncomfortably the moment the questions were raised. At first, there were denials, shakes of the head, long pauses that carried more meaning than words. But as minutes stretched, the resistance softened. A phrase here, a nod there, hints pointing towards separations that had once split siblings into different homes. It was not presented in full sentences, it slipped out more like sighs each time they pressed. The answers came piecemeal. They asked why details didn't match in the family records. The reply fell somewhere between explanation and avoidance. There had been, they were told, a custody battle, a disagreement that forced children apart, relocations decided behind closed doors. When pressed again, the elder stopped speaking altogether, eyes fixed on the carpet, lips tight against words that refused to leave. Silence filled the space heavier than any story could have. The next visit carried the same tone. An aunt leaned towards them, her voice low as though walls themselves might overhear. She admitted there had been paperwork filed under different names decades earlier. She admitted not everyone in the family knew the full truth. But each clarification slipped quickly into caution, as though too much honesty could still carry consequence. These were not tales told for nostalgia. They were fragments carried with reluctance, spoken like confessions pulled against the will. The couple listened intently, hoping for a clean line of history that explained their connection. Instead, they gathered broken details. A story of one child being moved from a city to a smaller town. Accounts of relatives arguing over who would take whom. Memories of courtrooms hinted at but never described. Each person they spoke to added only pieces, careful not to paint the entire picture. The result was a puzzle scattered with missing corners. It wasn't difficult to sense the reason for the evasion. Older generations often suppress troubling histories to preserve stability in the present. Families carry shame, secrets, or choices made under pressure, and silence becomes their chosen defense. Studies of memory and culture suggest that certain truths were often buried, not for cruelty, but because speaking them threatened to unsettle younger lives. What the couple encountered was this instinct in action. Elders guarded themselves, speaking only when pressed, and even then stopping short of the whole. For the couple, listening was as much an emotional trial as an informational one. Words came in fragments, then ended abruptly as if someone had closed a door. At first, they tried to assemble these pieces like puzzle work, but the gaps kept widening. A phrase about a lost child, a reference to a court dispute, a comment about families being forced to choose sides. Then silence. Each pause felt almost louder than what had been said. The absence of detail spoke volumes. There were moments when they thought they heard confirmation, a hesitant pause after a question about names, a reluctant tilt of the head when asked if siblings had been separated. Verbal admissions never came in a clean sentence, but between the stammering and the refusal to look them in the eye, clarity hovered close. They could see it in the way older hands shook as teacups were lifted, in the way voices broke when changing the subject. The truth did not need to be spoken fully to make itself known. The weight of these conversations left its mark. Driving away from one relative's home, the couple sat in silence. Each replayed the words in their mind, filling the gaps with suspicion. What they realized was that silence itself had become an answer. In refusing to speak, every elder revealed more than they intended. Silence in families often signals the preservation of history too heavy to relive. And here, it was confirmation that the paperwork and the photograph had not been lies of coincidence. They were signs of reality. The people they spoke to did not intend to wound them. That much was clear. When words did come, they carried sorrow more than deception. The pieces, stories of separation, custody battles never explained, children moving between homes, emerged like reluctant whispers of something once unbearable. It was as if each elder believed that by holding back the full version, harm could still be avoided. But for the couple, half-truths became unbearable in a different way. They were no longer children kept from pain. They were adults demanding the truth to hold their lives intact. Verbal admissions, though incomplete, began to line up in their memory once they returned home. Custody disputes from decades earlier seemed to confirm why their histories included sudden relocations. Unspoken nods about adoption and household divisions matched records that had seemed unclear before. Even without a relative saying it plain, the consistency of fragments tied their suspicions together. The ground beneath their marriage shook harder than ever. Night after night, they replayed these conversations. They knew they now stood at the edge of a discovery that would no longer tolerate denial. Photographs had suggested it. Records had confirmed it on paper. And now spoken hints, gestures and silences by those who had lived with the secret brought it fully into the present. The final truth lay close enough to touch. In the weeks that followed, their pursuit grew sharper. The last veil would not be lifted by quiet nods or silences held too long. It would emerge from the one undeniable source, still waiting for them. An official record able to break apart the echo of half-truths. And on the day they found that single piece of confirmation, every memory they treasured together would collapse beneath its weight. What lingers beyond the couple's collapse is not their grief alone, but the unease it plants in anyone who hears their story. You find yourself asking, what exactly defines family? Is it the blood that runs quietly, unchosen through our bodies? Is it the bonds we commit to out of trust and love? Or is it fate, the force that threads people together regardless of intention? Their tragedy leaves those questions pressing harder than any single answer. Hidden histories hold remarkable power. Entire identities can be reshaped when a name appears where it should not. When photographs reveal connections left unsaid. When bureaucratic lines of ink contradict the life you thought you lived. In this case, love and kinship collided with devastating clarity. But in a wider sense, the revelation shows how fragile the stories of self truly are. A single disclosure from the past can turn husbands into brothers, or strangers into kin. Nothing about how you understand yourself is immune when hidden histories surface. Couples often speak of their connection as timeless, as though destiny had guided their meeting. Stories of chance encounters, unlikely meetings, or instant chemistry often feed that belief. But here, destiny bore a darker detail. What felt like stars aligning was not the universe drawing them across cities or through chance crossings. It was heritage, kept hidden, eventually collapsing on them with the weight of inevitability. The romance they celebrated as fate had, in truth, been fate embedded in bloodlines long before their vows. Fate carried its cruel irony into every part of their bond. At first glance, their attraction appeared like chemistry without explanation. Two lives finding rhythm so naturally that it seemed predestined. Yet complexity quietly shaped that love, not through mystery, but through familiarity. Shared gestures, mirrored tones of voice, overlapping memories tucked into their childhoods. What should have remained in the vault of family history had instead spilled into their marriage, disguised as harmony. Fate smiled at them, but it was the smile of contradiction, binding them through forces they never invited. This is where themes larger than their lives surface. Genetics, the invisible map built before birth, has its silent role. Law, in its stark language, has the job of separating what society accepts from what it forbids. Memory, fragile and easily distorted, adds both confusion and revelation. And secrecy, something carried consciously by older hands, becomes the mechanism that delays truth until its release feels catastrophic. Together, these forces illustrate how identity is not a single thread, but a web. And when part of that web is exposed or broken, the entire shape changes. The paradox is sharp. Their love does not cease to exist because of what they found. All those memories remain. They did laugh together. They did walk hand in hand. They did carry one another through daily life. Yet truth reframes every memory. It transforms warmth into tragedy, intimacy into taboo, trust into loss. Love, in their case, did not vanish, but it could no longer live untouched. It was rewritten not by their choice, but by the weight of truth they never expected to face. Some would argue the love was false because its foundation was built across forbidden kinship. Others would argue the love was real because it was formed in ignorance, sincere through every ordinary gesture until knowledge tore it apart. That tension remains forever unanswered. What matters is that both are true. Love was both genuine and impossible. It existed fully and was destroyed completely by a fact they could not bend. An analogy offers clarity. It is like a bridge built carefully, beams set, planks nailed, arching across a wide river. The path feels steady while it's crossed, but if you later learn the support beams were already rotting at the base, then every step you once took across it changes meaning. You did cross it, you did feel safe, but retrospect makes each step feel dangerous, and the bridge itself collapses under the truth of its own foundation. That was their marriage, solid while it stood, unstable once truth stripped the surface away. Their story leaves the larger question of how much of who we are is already scripted. Bloodlines carry hidden scripts that reveal themselves whether or not we consent. Legal systems attempt to record identity with clarity, but often conceal as much as they reveal. Family stories shape us, but memory bends with time, erasing parts and leaving shadows. We like to believe identity is choice, yet in their case, choice was undone by inheritance, by blood carrying a script they could not edit. The weight is not only theirs to bear. Viewers and listeners are drawn into reflection. How much in our own lives rests on truths we assume are stable? How many family connections remain untold in whispers, protected under silence that feels harmless until it breaks? Their tragedy amplifies that unease. It tells us that identity can be both chosen and revealed, often in conflict, and that fate can be a force of bonding or breaking, with little room in between. In the end, their love was not erased, but reframed into something tragic. Their laughter still existed. Their memories were still real. Yet now, every one of those memories carried a second meaning they could not control. What looked once like a story of joy became a story of collapse. That shift reveals that truth does not obliterate the past, it marks it permanently, forcing everyone who has lived it to see it through another lens. You might feel the urge to judge them, to weigh their experience against standards of morality or law. But the more unsettling invitation is reflection. Beyond their story lies the difficult truth that what happened to them could happen in other lives, in other families where secrets linger in the background. Their collapse is not spectacle but mirror, reminding you that history, fate, and family can carry scripts you never expected to read, and that love itself can be rewritten by forces outside your control. Love can shift in an instant, from hope that seems unshakable to tragedy carried on a single revelation. Their story shows how fragile even the strongest bond becomes when truth is uncovered late. Secrecy preserved for decades can change identity overnight, not by choice, but by force. As you think about them, ask yourself what histories linger in silence within your own family. What does it mean if who you are is already written in blood, long before you choose who to love? Is identity something you build, or something fate eventually reveals when shadows give way to light?